You know how we picture medieval princesses, the flowing gowns, the towers, the waiting around for some knight to show up and make everything wonderful. Maybe a dragon gets involved. Maybe there's a glass slipper situation. It's all very lovely and very much not what actually happened. The real story is messier, stranger, and honestly, a lot more interesting than any fairy tale. Because real princesses weren't just sitting around looking pretty. They were surviving, scheming, sometimes fighting actual battles, sometimes gambling away fortunes, sometimes falling in love with exactly the wrong person and doing something about it anyway. Tonight we're going to follow one of them. A princess named Joan who was born during a crusade in a place called Acre, which is how she ended up being called Joan of Acre. She had 4 sisters, and each of them found their own way to navigate a world that treated them like property. Some of their stories are heartbreaking, some are kind of hilarious. All of them are true. If you're new here, welcome. If these help you wind down at night, hit subscribe so you don't miss any. And I always like knowing where everyone's listening from, so drop your city and the time in the comments. It's weirdly comforting knowing there's people from all over settling in for the night at the same time. Or morning, depending on where you are. Alright, get comfortable and we'll get started. So imagine this. You wake up before dawn. Your eyes open to almost complete darkness because medieval castles had tiny windows. Like, aggressively tiny. The reason? Big windows meant weak walls, and weak walls meant dead people. So you're lying there in the dark, and the first thing you notice is the cold. Not like, oh, it's a bit chilly cold. We're talking about the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. The kind where you can see your breath even inside. The stone walls around you have never been truly warm. They can't be. Stone holds cold the same way it holds heat, and there's simply not enough heat to go around. Your bed has curtains around it, thick, heavy things, and you're grateful for them because they trap whatever warmth your body has made during the night. You've got furs piled on top of you, wool blankets beneath that, and still your nose is freezing. Now, the bed itself is actually pretty good as medieval beds go. You're a princess after all. The mattress is stuffed with feathers rather than straw. There's a wooden frame holding everything up off the floor, which matters more than you'd think because the floor is covered in rushes and straw and, well, whatever else has ended up in there over the past few weeks. We'll get to that. Your servant has already placed a brass pan filled with heated rocks beneath your covers at some point during the night. They're cold now, obviously, but for a few hours they made a difference. Okay, so you're lying there in the darkness, and you're maybe 7 years old, or 8, or 9. It doesn't really matter because your life has already been planned out for you. Your marriage has been negotiated. Your future husband has been selected. The treaties have been drafted. The only thing everyone's waiting for is for you to get old enough to actually go through with it. And that age, by the way, was 12. 12 years old. That was considered old enough to be married off and shipped to whatever foreign court your father had decided you belonged to. Some girls were betrothed even younger. We're talking 5-6 years old sitting through ceremonies where they're essentially being signed over to another family, like a property deed with a pulse. But here's the really messed up part. Nobody thought this was strange. This was just how things worked. If you were lucky enough to be born a princess, you were also unlucky enough to be valuable, and valuable things get sold. That's the whole point of having value. The other thing nobody tells you about medieval mornings is the smell. I know. Everyone always talks about how bad the past smelled, but honestly, you need to understand just how aggressive this was. The rushes on the floor of the Great Hall haven't been changed in a while. They're supposed to be fragrant, mixed with herbs like lavender or mint to make things smell nice. But after a few weeks, what you've actually got is a layer of dried grass mixed with spilled food, spilled drink, spilled everything else. Dogs have been in there. Bones from last night's dinner are buried somewhere in there. The occasional rat has definitely died in there. And the people haven't bathed the way you're thinking. This was before anyone had figured out that regular bathing was actually a good idea. In fact, a lot of people thought bathing was dangerous, that it opened your pores to disease. So the servants around you, the knights, the ladies, everyone, they're all carrying around the smell of weeks or months without a proper wash. They might splash some water on their face. They might use a scented cloth to wipe down occasionally. But that's about it. You get used to it. That's the thing. Your nose just kind of gives up after a while. It becomes normal, background. So you're lying there in your bed, this 7 or 8 or 9-year-old girl, and your ladies are arriving to get you dressed for the day. And getting dressed is not a simple thing. We're not talking about throwing on some jeans and a t-shirt here. Getting dressed as a medieval princess takes 30 minutes minimum, sometimes an hour. First there's the undergarment, a long linen shift that you've slept in. Then comes another layer over that. Then comes the actual dress, which is heavy because it's made of wool or velvet or some other substantial fabric. The really fancy stuff has fur trim, ermine if you're particularly royal. The dress is fitted tight at the bodice, and you need help getting into it because there are laces up the back that you can't reach. Yourself. Your hair gets braided and pinned and covered, because showing your hair as a noble woman was considered sort of scandalous. The style depends on what decade we're in, but there's almost certainly some kind of headdress involved. Maybe a simple veil, maybe something more elaborate with a frame. And the whole time this is happening, you're being reminded of who you are, what you are. Your ladies aren't just dressing you, they're coaching you, reminding you to stand up straight, to keep your eyes down when speaking to men of higher rank, to keep your voice soft, to remember that everything you do reflects on your father's house. Because that's the thing about being a princess in medieval England. You're never just yourself. You're an extension of your father's power, a walking, breathing symbol of everything he wants to project to the world. Your behaviour, your appearance, your reputation, all of it reflects on him. And that means any mistake you make isn't just your mistake, it's a political incident. Let me tell you about our girl Joan of Acre specifically. She was born in the spring of 1272. Her parents were on a crusade at the time, which is exactly as wild as it sounds. Her father, Prince Edward, would soon become King Edward I of England. Her mother, Eleanor of Castile, was a Spanish princess who had fallen in love with her English husband and refused to let him go fight in the Holy Land without her. So there's Eleanor, heavily pregnant, in a military encampment in the Middle East, and she gives birth to a baby girl. They name her Joan and add of Acre, so people will remember the circumstances of her birth, as if anyone could forget. Now here's where it gets complicated. Eleanor of Castile was what you might call a committed mother. She'd been pregnant basically constantly since her wedding. By the time Joan arrived, Eleanor had already given birth to at least 5 other children, maybe 6. Records are unclear. But here's the brutal truth. Most of them were already dead. 3 daughters hadn't survived past infancy. A son named John had died at 5. Another son named Henry would die at 6. This was just the reality of medieval childhood, even for royalty. Even with the best food and the warmest beds and the most attentive servants, children died. Constantly, relentlessly, of fevers and fluxes and coughs and things nobody could name or treat. Eleanor would go on to have about 16 pregnancies total. 16. And of all those children, only 6 would survive to adulthood, 5 daughters and 1 son. Joan was one of the lucky ones, but being lucky enough to survive came with its own special burden, because now you were old enough to be useful, old enough to be married off, old enough to serve your father's political ambitions. Joan's first proposed match came when she was still a little girl. Her father wanted to marry her to Hartman, the son of the King of the Romans. It was a good alliance. It would secure England's position in European politics. Everyone was excited about it. Then Hartman died in a shipwreck before the wedding could happen. Joan was maybe 10 years old when she learned that her future husband had drowned. And here's the thing that's kind of hard for us to understand from our modern perspective. Nobody expected her to be particularly upset about it. She had never met Hartman. She probably never would have loved him. The marriage wasn't about love. It was about politics. So when her father started shopping for a new husband for her, nobody thought twice about it. That's just how it worked. The man he eventually chose was Gilbert de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester. Gilbert was rich, like really rich, one of the most powerful barons in all of England. His lands were vast, his castles were numerous, his political influence was immense. He was also 46 years old. Joan was 18. Now, before you start thinking this was unusual, I need to tell you that it wasn't. Older men marrying much younger women was standard practice among the nobility. The math was simple. Young women were more fertile. They had more childbearing years ahead of them, and producing heirs was the entire point of the marriage. Did anyone care what Joan thought about marrying a man old enough to be her grandfather? They did not. Her father certainly didn't ask her opinion. The negotiations were about land and titles and political alliances. Joan's feelings didn't factor into the equation at all. But here's where Joan starts to get interesting. Because unlike a lot of medieval princesses, Joan had a personality, a strong one. The historical records describe her as high-spirited, stubborn, willful, the kind of girl who argued with her father's clerks when she thought her sisters were getting better treatment, the kind of girl who deliberately skipped her own sister's wedding just to prove she could. This was not a girl who was going to quietly accept whatever life handed her. This was a girl who was going to fight back. But she was still just a girl, and the system she was born into was a lot bigger and a lot older, and a lot more powerful than any individual person, no matter how stubborn. So in April of 1290, 18-year-old Joan of Acre married 46-year-old Gilbert de Clare in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was grand, the guests were illustrious, the dress was probably incredible, though we don't have detailed records of it. What we do know is that Gilbert had been trying to win Joan's favour before the wedding. He'd bought her expensive gifts, lavish clothing, jewellery. He was apparently quite taken with her. Whether Joan was taken with him is another question entirely. What we do know is that Joan did her duty. She did what was expected of her. She moved into her husband's household. She took over management of his estates. She started having children almost immediately. Their first child, a son named Gilbert, arrived in 1291. Joan was 19. Then came 3 daughters in quick succession, Eleanor, Margaret and Elizabeth. By the time Joan was 23, she was a mother of 4, and then, in December of 1295, Gilbert de Clare died. Joan was suddenly a widow, a very rich widow. She owned some of the most valuable lands in England. She had proven she was fertile. She was still young enough to have more children. In other words, she was once again the most valuable commodity on the medieval marriage market. Her father, King Edward, immediately started looking for her next husband. He had his eye on Amadeus V, the Count of Savoy. Another political alliance, another foreign marriage, another man Joan had never met and would probably never love. But Joan, remember, was stubborn. Joan was willful. Joan had spent her entire life being told what to do and where to go and who to marry. And Joan had other plans. Because while everyone was negotiating her future without her consent, Joan had fallen in love with someone entirely unsuitable. Someone who was absolutely, categorically, completely unacceptable. She had fallen in love with Ralph de Mortimer. Ralph was a squire, not a lord, not an earl, not a count or a duke or anything with a title attached to his name. He was a squire in her late husband's household, a knight in training, a man of such obscure origins that historians still don't know who his parents were. And Joan didn't just fall in love with him. She did something unthinkable. She married him, in secret, without telling anyone, definitely without asking her father's permission. Joan of Acre, Princess of England, daughter of the most powerful king in Europe, married a nobody. And when her father found out what she had done, he was so angry that, according to some accounts, he threw his own crown into the fire. But that's a story for later. For now, just picture Joan lying in her bed in the darkness before dawn. A little girl with her whole life planned out for her. A little girl who didn't know yet just how much she would end up fighting back. Your bed is probably a lot more comfortable than hers was. Your room is probably warmer. Nobody's negotiating your marriage while you sleep. Nobody owns you the way Joan was owned. Something to think about as you settle in deeper under those covers of yours. So here's something they definitely leave out of the Disney movies. Medieval princesses didn't just live in one castle. They lived in all of them. Or none of them, depending on how you look at it. The English royal court was basically a travelling circus, and I mean that almost literally. The king didn't sit in one palace running things from a throne room. He moved, constantly, up and down the country from castle to monastery to some nobleman's estate, dragging his entire household with him. And when I say entire household, I'm talking hundreds of people, servants, cooks, clerks, knights, priests, ladies-in-waiting, stable hands, the people who emptied the chamber pots, the people who carried the furniture. Yes, they brought the furniture. Beds, chairs, tapestries, cooking equipment, everything packed up and loaded onto carts and wagons and hauled down muddy roads to the next location. Joan and her sisters grew up in this chaos. If you were over 8 years old, you travelled with the court. That was just how it worked. Your childhood wasn't spent in one nursery, with one set of toys and one view from your window. Your childhood was spent bouncing from place to place, never quite settling, always packing up and moving on. Picture it. You're 9 years old. You've just gotten used to the layout of whatever castle you're staying in. You know which stairs creak. You know which corners are drafty. You know where the kitchen is, and which servants will sneak you an extra honey cake if you smile at them right. And then one morning everyone starts packing. The tapestries come down off the walls, the beds get dismantled, your clothes get folded into chests, and you're loaded into a carriage or put on a horse, and off you go, down roads that aren't really roads at all. Medieval roads were terrible. I cannot stress this enough. We're not talking about paved highways here. We're talking about dirt tracks that turned into mud pits when it rained. Ruts so deep your cartwheels could get stuck for hours. Rocks and holes that would jar your teeth loose if you weren't careful. In winter, the roads froze solid and became ice rinks. In spring, they flooded. In summer, the dust was so thick you'd be coughing it up for days afterward. The only good travel season was maybe a few weeks in autumn, and even then you were racing against the early rains. Bridges were rare. Rivers had to be forded, which meant getting wet and cold and hoping your horse didn't slip on the rocks. Bandits lurked in the forests. Wolves were a genuine concern in some areas. A simple journey of 20 miles might take an entire day, and that was if nothing went wrong. And the carriages, oh, the carriages. If you were lucky enough to ride in one instead of on horseback, you were in for a treat. These things had no suspension, none. No springs, no shock absorbers, nothing between you and every single bump in the road. You'd be bounced around like a bean in a jar. Hours and hours of this, sometimes days. The really fancy carriages had cushions inside, embroidered seats, maybe some curtains to keep out the dust, painted panels on the outside, gilded edges, all very impressive looking. But underneath all that decoration, you were still just sitting in a wooden box being dragged over rough ground by horses who didn't care about your comfort. By the end of a long journey, you'd have bruises in places you didn't know could bruise. Most women actually preferred to ride horseback. At least on a horse you could move with the animal. You had some control. In a carriage you were just along for the ride, getting bruised every time you hit a pothole. And here's the thing, this wasn't just occasional travel, this was constant. The court might stay in one place for a few weeks, maybe a month or two if the king had business there, but then they'd move again, and again, and again. Some years the court covered hundreds of miles, zigzagging across England like a very slow, very uncomfortable road trip with no end destination. Joan's father, King Edward, was particularly restless. He was always going somewhere. Wales for a military campaign, Scotland for another military campaign, France because something needed negotiating, and wherever he went the court followed, and the royal children followed, and everyone's belongings followed in those rattling, jolting carts. So that's the physical reality. But there was also an education happening during all this chaos. Medieval princesses weren't taught the same things medieval princes were taught. Nobody was training Joan to lead armies or understand military strategy. That was for her brothers. What Joan learned was how to be useful in a different way. She learned languages. French was essential because that's what the English court actually spoke most of the time. Latin was important for religious purposes, maybe some Spanish because of her mother's background. The ability to communicate with foreign dignitaries and ambassadors was part of what made a princess valuable. She learned music, how to play instruments, how to sing, how to appreciate performances. This wasn't just entertainment. Music was a social skill. A princess who could hold her own in a musical evening was a princess who could charm visiting nobles and impress potential suitors. She learned needlework, embroidery, spinning, the kind of delicate handwork that demonstrated patience and refinement. Some of these pieces were genuinely beautiful, works of art in thread and silk. Others were more practical, but the skill itself was the point. And she learned household management. This was actually the big one. Because when a princess got married, she wasn't just becoming someone's wife. She was taking over the running of a massive estate. Hundreds of servants to manage, accounts to balance, food supplies to organize, disputes to settle, guest accommodations to arrange, religious observances to maintain. A medieval noblewoman ran her household the way a modern executive runs a corporation. She needed to know how much grain was in storage and how long it would last. She needed to know which servants were trustworthy and which ones needed watching. She needed to know how to host a visiting dignitary with the proper ceremony and how to handle it when supplies ran short. All of this, and she was expected to do it while also being pregnant most of the time and raising the children she'd already had. Joan's mother, Eleanor of Castile, took education seriously. She taught her daughters herself, at least some of the time. They read together. Romances and histories and devotional works, poetry, stories of knights and ladies and great deeds. These weren't just bedtime stories. They were lessons in how to behave, what to value, who to admire. The girls learned their prayers in Latin. They memorized psalms and hymns. Religion wasn't optional. It was woven into every part of daily life, from the morning mass to the evening prayers to the saints' days that broke up the calendar year. And some of them learned to write. This was actually rare. A lot of noble women could read but not write. Writing was considered almost a separate skill, something clerks and monks did. But there are records of purchases of writing tablets for Joan's older sister Eleanor, which suggest she was practicing. Actually putting pen to paper, or stylus to wax tablet, learning to form letters and words. Joan was apparently quick, sharp. The historical records paint a picture of a girl who paid attention and remembered things and wasn't afraid to speak up when she disagreed, which, in a world where girls were supposed to be quiet and obedient, was already a problem. But Joan wasn't the only princess navigating this world. Let me tell you about some others, because their stories show just how differently things could go. There was another Joan, Joan of England, born in 1210. She was the daughter of King John, the one from the Robin Hood stories, the one who had to sign the Magna Carta. This Joan had a rougher time of it. She got passed around like a parcel nobody quite knew what to do with. First she was promised to the son of the French king. Then her father changed his mind and promised her to someone else entirely, a French nobleman named Hugh, as compensation for some complicated family drama involving her own mother. So little Joan got shipped off to France to be raised at the French court until she was old enough to marry this Hugh. She was given a county and an island as her dowry. Everything was set. Then Hugh decided he wanted the lands before the wedding. When he didn't get them, he lost interest. Just like that. This child's entire future depended on whether some adult man felt like going through with the deal, and he didn't. Meanwhile, Joan's father died. Her mother, who had never been particularly interested in motherhood, decided to marry Hugh herself. Yes, the same Hugh who had been engaged to Joan. Her own mother swooped in and married the man Joan had been raised to think of as her future husband. So Joan got sent home to England and married off to someone else entirely, Alexander II of Scotland. Joan was 11. Alexander was 23. They made her Queen of Scotland at 11 years old, a child bride in a foreign court surrounded by people she didn't know, married to a man who was twice her age. She didn't have any children, which was a problem because children were the whole point. Alexander apparently wanted to annul the marriage, but he was afraid of starting a war with England, so he stayed married to a wife he didn't particularly want. Joan spent years in this awkward, loveless situation, a queen in name but not really in control of anything, living in a court that wasn't her home, surrounded by people who probably whispered about her behind her back, the wife who couldn't produce an heir, the English princess who wasn't really wanted. Eventually she went on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, travelling with her sister-in-law. Maybe she was praying for a child. Maybe she was just trying to get away for a while. We don't really know. And then she got sick, and then she died, at 27, in the arms of her brother King Henry III. He had come to see her, at the end. Family, in the final moments, when it was too late to change anything. 27 years old. Passed from hand to hand her entire life. never really in control of anything, dead before she'd barely begun to figure out who she might have been if anyone had let her choose. That was one version of how it could go. Here's another. Adela of Normandy was born around 1062. Her father was William the Conqueror. Yes, that William. The one who invaded England and won at Hastings and changed everything. Adela was his youngest daughter, which meant she was never going to inherit anything. Daughters didn't inherit when there were sons around, but her bloodline alone made her valuable. She was 15 when they married her off to Stephen II, Count of Blois. Stephen was 35, 20 years older than her. This was, as we've established, completely normal. But here's where Adela's story gets different. Because Adela wasn't just some quiet girl who went along with whatever happened to her. Adela was smart, educated, high-spirited, the records say. She paid attention. She learned. And when she got to her husband's court, she didn't just sit around doing needlework and waiting to have babies. She got involved. She ran things. When Stephen went off on crusade and made the mistake of running away from a battle, Adela was reportedly so ashamed of him that she convinced him to go back and try again. He died on the second attempt, but at least he died with honour. That's how Adela saw it anyway. After his death, Adela ruled as regent for her sons. She made political decisions. She negotiated with other nobles. She was, by all accounts, better at the job than her husband had ever been. One of her sons eventually became King of England, Stephen of Blois, who fought a long civil war against his cousin Matilda for the throne. He might never have gotten there without his mother's influence, her connections, her political savvy. Adela lived into her 60s, which was ancient by medieval standards. She spent her final years as a nun, still sharp, still involved, still writing letters and offering advice. Same system, same rules about being a princess and getting married off and serving your father's ambitions. Completely different outcome. Adela found a way to make it work for her. Joan of Acre had that same spark, that same stubbornness, that same refusal to just accept whatever happened to her. The question was whether she'd end up like the first Joan, trapped and powerless and dead young, or like Adela, finding a way to carve out something real for herself. When Joan's first husband Gilbert died, she was 23, old enough to know what she wanted, young enough to still want it badly. And what she wanted was Ralph. He wasn't supposed to be in the picture at all. A squire, a nobody, the kind of man a princess would walk past without seeing. But somehow, in the chaos of running her late husband's household, in the grief and the confusion and the sudden freedom of being a widow, Joan noticed him. Maybe it was the way he carried himself. Maybe it was something he said. Maybe it was just the right person at the right moment, the way love sometimes works when you're not expecting it. She convinced her father to knight him. That was step one. Turn the squire into a proper knight at least. Give him a title, even a minor one. And then, in January of 1297, while her father was busy planning her marriage to some foreign count she'd never met, Joan did something unthinkable. She married Ralph in secret. No announcement, no negotiations, no treaties or dowries or political calculations. Just a wedding, hidden from everyone who would have stopped it. By the time her father found out, it was already done. She was already pregnant with Ralph's child. There was no undoing it. The king, when he learned what his daughter had done, was not pleased. He was, in fact, absolutely furious. But what happened next, how Joan faced down the most powerful man in England and somehow won, that's where this story really gets good. Your pillow is probably getting more comfortable by now. Let yourself sink into it a little deeper. We've got time. King Edward I was not a man you crossed lightly. This was the guy who conquered Wales and built a chain of massive fortresses across it, just to make sure everyone knew who was in charge. He fought wars in Scotland that earned him the nickname Hammer of the Scots. He expelled the entire Jewish population from England. When Edward got angry, people died, and now his favourite daughter had married a nobody, in secret, without asking. When he found out, Edward didn't just get mad. According to the stories that have come down to us, he ripped the crown off his own head and threw it into the fire. That's the level of fury we're talking about here. The King of England, one of the most powerful men in the medieval world, so enraged that he literally threw his crown into the flames. Ralph was arrested immediately, dragged off to Bristol Castle and thrown into a cell. No trial, no hearing, nothing. When the king says you're a prisoner, you're a prisoner. And Bristol wasn't some comfortable house arrest situation. It was a real prison. Cold stone walls, iron bars, guards who answered to the king and nobody else. Ralph had gone from sleeping beside a princess to sleeping on straw in a dungeon. He had no idea if he would ever get out. He had no idea if he would live. Joan's lands were seized. Every castle, every manor, every piece of property she'd inherited from Gilbert. Gone, just like that. The official order went out with a warning that the royal officers better not drag their feet on this one if they knew what was good for them. The actual wording threatened them with the king's wrath if they failed to execute the order. Edward's wrath was not something anyone wanted to face, and Joan herself was basically put under house arrest. She couldn't come to court, couldn't see her father, couldn't plead her case, couldn't do much of anything except sit in one of her remaining properties and wait to find out what would happen to her and her new husband. Was Ralph going to be executed? Was she going to be locked away in a convent for the rest of her life? She didn't know. Nobody would tell her. This went on for months. Spring turned to summer. Joan's pregnancy started showing more and more, and Edward continued to pretend like nothing had happened, still trying to arrange her marriage to the Count of Savoy, as if she weren't already married, as if there weren't already a child growing inside her. But here's the thing about Joan. She didn't just sit there and accept her punishment. She started working on her father's emotions. First, she sent her 3 little daughters from her first marriage to visit their grandfather. These were small children, cute and innocent, and they were Edward's grandchildren. He loved his grandchildren. Joan knew that, so she put them on a cart and sent them to court, hoping their sweet faces might soften the old man's heart. It didn't work, not right away at least. Edward received his granddaughters, probably couldn't help but be charmed by them, but he still wouldn't back down about the marriage. So Joan tried another approach. She got the Bishop of Durham involved. Anthony Beck was his name, and he was one of the most powerful churchmen in England. He started working on the king, pushing him to accept the marriage, pointing out that what was done and couldn't be undone. And then, finally in July of 1297, Edward agreed to hear his daughter's case. Picture this scene: the royal court at St. Albans, the great hall packed with nobles and bishops and knights, everyone there to witness what would happen. The king on his throne, 60 years old now, still tall and imposing, still terrifying when he wanted to be. His grey beard, his cold eyes, the crown back on his head, probably a replacement for the one he threw in the fire. And Joan, visibly pregnant now, her belly obvious beneath her gown, standing before her father to plead for her marriage and her husband's life. She had to know that everything depended on what happened in this room. If she failed to convince her father, Ralph might never leave that cell in Bristol. She might never see him again. The tension must have been incredible. Everyone watching, everyone waiting to see what the king would do. One of the nobles present, probably trying to score points with the king, stood up and started railing against the marriage. He thundered, apparently that's the word the chronicler uses, thundered into the ears of the king about how shameful this whole thing was. So many great men had sought the princess's hand, and she had given herself to this nobody, this squire of unknown origins. What kind of example did this set? What would other kingdoms think of England if they let this stand? Joan listened to this tirade, and then she responded. The chronicler Thomas Walsingham recorded at least part of what she said, and it's been quoted ever since as one of the great moments of medieval female defiance. She said something like this: "It is not considered shameful or disgraceful for a great earl to take a poor and lowly woman to wife. Why then should it be blameworthy or difficult for a countess to raise up a gallant young man?" Think about that for a second. She's standing in front of her furious father, in front of all these powerful nobles who think she's disgraced herself, and she's basically saying, "You all marry poor women all the time and nobody blinks an eye. What's the difference if I marry a poor man?" It was a logical argument. It was also incredibly bold. She was calling out the double standard right to their faces, and you know what? It worked. Maybe it was her argument. Maybe it was the Bishop of Durham's lobbying. Maybe it was the sight of his pregnant daughter standing there, defiant and unbroken. Maybe Edward just got tired of fighting about it. Or maybe, and some historians think this was the real reason, Edward saw an opportunity. See, at that exact moment, the king was dealing with a rebellion among his own barons. The most powerful nobles in England were refusing to go fight in his wars unless he gave them more rights. It was a political crisis. And here was his daughter, married to a man who had no connections, no powerful family, no loyalty to anyone except the king who had spared his life. If Edward accepted Ralph, he could give him Gilbert's titles and lands. That would put one of the biggest earldoms in England in the hands of someone who owed everything to Edward personally. Someone who would be grateful. Someone who would be loyal. Politics and family feelings, all tangled up together. That's how medieval royalty worked. Whatever the combination of reasons, Edward gave in. At the end of July 1297, Ralph de Monthermer was released from Bristol Castle. He was summoned to Parliament as the Earl of Gloucester and Hertford. Joan got her lands back. The marriage was officially recognised. Joan had won. And here's what makes this story even better. It wasn't just a political accommodation. Joan and Ralph actually seemed to have loved each other. They had 4 more children together, 2 sons and 2 daughters. Their eldest son Thomas would grow up to fight in the wars against France and die at the Battle of Sluys in 1340. Their daughter Mary would marry Duncan, the Earl of Fife, one of the most powerful nobles in Scotland. Another daughter, also named Joan, became a nun at Amesbury Abbey, the same place where her Aunt Mary lived with her gambling debts and her expensive wine. Their son Edward would carry on the family name. For about 10 years, Joan and Ralph lived as husband and wife in what seems to have been a genuinely happy marriage. They managed their estates together. The manor at Clare in Suffolk became their main home, a beautiful property in the English countryside where they could raise their blended family. 8 children between them, 4 from Joan's first marriage and 4 from the second. A busy household, full of noise and life. By all accounts, they were content, maybe even happy. In a world where most noble marriages were cold business arrangements, Where husbands and wives often barely knew each other, Joan and Ralph had found something rare, something real. Ralph turned out to be a capable man too, good at warfare, skilled at politics, loyal and reliable. Edward eventually grew quite fond of his unexpected son-in-law. The king who had thrown his crown into the fire in rage came to respect the man his daughter had chosen. There's even a story that Ralph once saved the life of Robert Bruce, the Scottish rebel who would later become king. According to this tale, Ralph overheard Edward planning to arrest Bruce while the Scottish lord was visiting the English court. Rather than stay silent, Ralph sent Bruce a coded message. Some coins bearing the king's head and a pair of spurs. The meaning was clear. The king wants your head. Use the spurs and ride. Bruce escaped. Years later, at the Battle of Bannockburn, the Scots crushed the English army and took Ralph prisoner. Robert Bruce, now King of Scotland, remembered the man who had saved his life. He released Ralph without demanding any ransom, even hosted him at a celebratory banquet first. That's the kind of man Joan chose. Someone brave, someone honourable, someone who would take a risk to do the right thing even when it might cost him everything. But Joan's defiance didn't end with her marriage. She never really stopped pushing back against her father when she thought he was wrong. Years later, in 1305, Joan's younger brother Edward got into serious trouble with their father. This was the future Edward II, the one who had become king after their father died. He was a teenager then, and he'd become close friends with a young man named Piers Gaveston. Their father didn't approve. Edward I thought Gaveston was a bad influence, thought the friendship was too intense, maybe thought other things about it that he didn't want to say out loud. He confiscated some of his son's income and lands as punishment. He took away the prince's royal seal, which meant the young man couldn't officially authorize any purchases or documents. Joan heard about this, and she did something about it. She sent her own seal to her brother, her personal seal, the one that authorized her signature, the one that gave legal weight to documents. She told him he could use it to buy anything he liked. This was a direct act of defiance against her father. Using her seal meant her brother could spend money, make purchases, do business, all the things their father was trying to prevent. Joan was basically bankrolling her brother's rebellion against the king. When Edward I found out, he ordered his son to return his sister's seal immediately. But here's the interesting part. Joan faced no consequences, no punishment, no seizure of lands, no house arrest, nothing. Either the old king had given up trying to control his stubborn daughter, or he respected her too much to punish her, or he was just too tired by that point. He was getting old. He'd been fighting wars his whole life. Maybe he didn't have the energy to discipline Joan anymore. Or maybe he secretly admired her loyalty to her brother. Family looking out for family, even when it meant breaking the rules. That was something Edward could understand. Joan died on April 23rd, 1307. She was about 35 years old. The exact cause isn't certain. Some historians think she might have died giving birth to a 9th child who didn't survive. Others think it was illness. We don't really know. She was buried at the Priory in Clare, Suffolk. The altar recess on the ruins of the south wall is thought to mark where her tomb once stood. Her father died just a few months later, on his way to fight yet another war in Scotland. He never stopped fighting, that man. Never stopped conquering. Never stopped being terrible and great in equal measure. Joan's brother became King Edward II. He was not a good king. His friendship with Piers Gaveston would eventually help tear the kingdom apart. But that's a story for another time. Ralph lost his titles when Joan died. The earldom of Gloucester went to Gilbert's son from Joan's first marriage, but Ralph was given the title of Baron Mortimer, and he continued serving the crown faithfully. He even married again about 11 years later. Another secret marriage to a woman named Isabel. Some people never learn. But let's not end Joan's story on sadness. Let's remember her at her best. A princess who was supposed to be a political tool, a piece on her father's chessboard, a commodity to be traded for alliances. A woman who looked at all those expectations and said no. Who fell in love with a man she wasn't supposed to love and married him anyway. Who stood in front of the most powerful king in Europe and argued for her right to choose her own life. She didn't overthrow the system. She didn't change how things worked for everyone. But she carved out a space for herself within it. She found love, real love, in a world where love was supposed to be irrelevant. She raised children with a man she chose, not a man chosen for her. And she never stopped being defiant, never stopped pushing back, never stopped being Joan. That's worth something. Your blanket is probably feeling heavier now, warmer. Let it hold you the way Joan must have wished someone had held her. All those cold nights in stone castles, wondering what was going to happen next. We're not done yet. Joan had sisters, remember? 5 of them who survived childhood. Each one of them found their own way through this world of arranged marriages and political calculations. There was Eleanor, the fighter, Margaret, the architect, Mary, the gambler, Elizabeth, the traveller, each of them with their own story, their own struggles, their own small victories. Let's meet them. Eleanor was the oldest, the firstborn daughter who survived anyway, and for years she was basically treated like a prince. See, Eleanor of Castile had 16 pregnancies. 16. And most of those children died. Babies who never made it past their first year. Toddlers who caught fevers and were gone within days. Children who seemed fine one moment and were buried the next. It was the brutal mathematics of medieval childhood, and Eleanor of Castile knew it better than most. So when the oldest surviving daughter was Eleanor, and she kept surviving, and her brothers kept dying, something interesting happened. Edward started training her like she might actually inherit something. She learned statecraft, politics, how kingdoms worked, the kind of education that normally only went to boys, because boys were the ones who would rule. But Edward had lost so many sons by the time Eleanor was a teenager that he couldn't afford to assume there would be another male heir. So Eleanor learned. She was close to her grandmother, Eleanor of Provence, who had been Queen Consort of England. She was close to her sickly brother Henry, the one everyone thought might be the heir, until he died when he was 6. She watched sibling after sibling get buried. She learned early that nothing was guaranteed. When Eleanor was still young, her father betrothed her to Alfonso III of Aragon. It should have been a great match. But there was a problem. Alfonso's parents were under papal interdict because of some complicated business about the throne of Sicily. The Pope had basically said their claim was invalid, and anyone who supported them was in trouble with the church. Edward dragged his feet on the marriage for years. Alfonso kept writing, asking when his bride was coming. Edward kept finding reasons to delay. At one point he claimed that Eleanor, who was 13 at the time, was too young, which was ridiculous by medieval standards. Girls got married younger than that all the time. The real reason was probably political. Edward didn't want to offend the Pope. He didn't want to get tangled up in Aragonese problems, so Eleanor waited and waited. And Alfonso eventually died in 1291, still unmarried to the English princess he'd been promised. Eleanor finally got married in 1293. She was about 24 by then, practically ancient by medieval bride standards. Her husband was Henri III, Count of Bar, a small but strategically important territory in what's now northeastern France. The marriage seems to have been decent. They had at least 2 children, maybe more. Eleanor had grown up watching her mother run a household and manage estates and navigate the complicated world of medieval politics. She was ready. And then, 4 years into her marriage, Henri got captured. He was fighting near the town of Lille when the French took him prisoner and hauled him off to Paris. Eleanor was left alone in Bar with an army that had just lost its commander, a castle that needed defending, and children who needed protecting. Here's where all that training paid off. Eleanor organised what was left of Henri's forces. She didn't panic. She didn't flee. She did what she'd been taught to do. She took command. A 14th century court writer once noted that a princess needed to know how to use weapons so that she may be ready to command her men if the need arises. Eleanor apparently took this seriously. She defended the castle, she held the territory, and she wrote to her father, King Edward, asking for allies and money to pay Henry's ransom. Edward came through. He sent what she needed. Henry was eventually ransomed and released. The family survived. But Eleanor didn't live long after that. She died in 1298, at only 29 years old, probably in childbirth. Like so many women of her time, she survived wars and sieges only to die bringing a new life into the world. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, though nobody quite remembers where her grave is now. That was Eleanor, the fighter, the one trained like a prince who proved she deserved it. Now let's talk about Mary. She was different. Mary was born in 1278, the 4th surviving daughter, and when she was 7 years old, her grandmother decided that Mary should become a nun. This wasn't Mary's choice. She was 7. 7-year-olds don't make career decisions. Her grandmother, Eleanor of Provence, had retired to Amesbury Priory in Wiltshire and wanted company. She wanted her granddaughter with her, and what the Dowager Queen wanted she usually got. Mary's mother wasn't happy about it. The Chronicle specifically notes that Mary's dedication to the priory was done by her father at the request of her grandmother, but only with the assent of her mother. That careful wording suggests Eleanor of Castile had reservations. Maybe she thought 7 was too young. Maybe she wanted Mary to have other options. We don't know for sure. But Mary went to the priory. She was formally veiled as a nun when she was 12, which made it official and permanent. She would spend the rest of her life there. Except, here's the thing, Mary didn't really live like a nun. She had private quarters. She got £100 a year from her father, which was a small fortune. That got doubled to £200 after her grandmother died. She also got 40 oak trees a year from the royal forests and 20 barrels of wine from Southampton. Special wine, the good stuff. She travelled constantly. Despite being supposedly cloistered, Mary went on pilgrimages all over England. She visited court regularly, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. She showed up at family events. She travelled with a retinue that required 24 horses, and she gambled. Mary loved dice. She would go to court and find the games and play, and she was apparently terrible at it. In 1305, her father had to give her £200 just to pay off her gambling debts. £200. That was 2 years of her already generous allowance, blown on bad dice rolls. Her father paid it off anyway. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, the man who threw his own crown into the fire when he got angry, just quietly settled his gambling daughter's debts, and let her go back to the priory. But Mary wasn't only about dice and wine. She was also a scholar. She commissioned books. She had one written about the history of her father's reign, and she had it written in Anglo-Norman, the dialect she actually spoke, which suggests she intended to read it herself, not just own it for show, actually read it. Being literate in both reading and writing was rare, even for nobility. Most noble women could read a little, but couldn't write at all. Writing was considered a separate skill, something for clerks and monks. But there are records of writing tablets being purchased for the royal daughters, which means at least some of them were learning to actually put words on a page. Mary lived until about 1332, well into her 50s. She never held a high position in the religious order. She never became abbess or prioress, but she carved out a comfortable life for herself within the walls that had been chosen for her. Wine and dice and books and enough freedom to do pretty much whatever she wanted. After her death, there was a strange accusation. The Earl of Surrey claimed he'd had an affair with her and tried to use that as grounds for annulling his marriage to her niece. Whether it was true or just a desperate legal ploy, nobody knows. Mary wasn't around to defend herself. Next came Margaret. Margaret was the third surviving daughter, born in 1275. She was 3 years old when her father betrothed her to the future Duke of Brabant, a territory in what's now Belgium. Both children were 3. Their fathers shook hands on a deal that would bind their lives together before either of them could read.